Hey guys, tonight we're spending some time with one of the oldest and quietest mysteries in the history of the sea. 3 lighthouse keepers on a remote island off the far northwest of Scotland, gone without a trace one winter afternoon in 1900. Their names were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur. They were ordinary working men with families waiting for them on shore. And one day, they were simply not there anymore. The lamp they were paid to keep burning had gone dark. The hearth was cold. The beds were empty. And in the more than 120 years since, no one has ever been able to say with certainty what happened to them. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. No pressure and no guilt. And thank you, truly, to everyone who has sent in case suggestions. We are also now on Spotify, so check the description for the link if you would rather listen there. Now, dim the lights. Get comfortable. This is a long one, and the story of these 3 men deserves to be heard slowly and carefully, because somewhere underneath all the legend that has grown up around this island, the strange poems and the films and the ghost stories, there were 3 real people, 3 men who climbed the same 160 steps every day, 3 men who trimmed the same lamp, who wrote the same weather readings on the same slate, who kept a single light burning so that strangers they would never meet could find their way safely home across a dark and dangerous sea. Have you ever wondered what it would take to disappear so completely that not even the people who searched for you could say how it happened? To leave behind a room that looked almost ordinary, almost as if you had only stepped outside for a minute, and yet to never come back. And have you ever wondered how a place can hold its silence for more than a century, giving up nothing, no matter how many people come looking for the truth? To understand this, we need to go back to the very edge of the map, to a scatter of green rocks in the grey Atlantic, and to the 3 men who were sent to live there. Let's start at the beginning. There is a small village on the west side of the Isle of Lewis called Brescleet. It sits near a sea loch called Loch Rogue, a sheltered stretch of water where boats can lie at anchor even when the open ocean beyond is heaving. In the year 1900, Brescleet was a place of low stone houses, of crofts and fishing and peat smoke, the kind of Hebridean village where everyone knew everyone, and where the rhythm of life had not changed much in generations. And at the edge of that village, brand new and a little out of place among the older black houses, stood a large sandstone building. The locals called it Eilean Mor, the big house. It had been finished only the year before, in 1899, and it was the first building in Brescleet to have running water, which in that time and that place made it something close to a marvel. It had been designed by the Stephenson family, the famous dynasty of engineers who built most of Scotland's lighthouses, and it was built for a particular purpose. It was a shore station, a home on land for the families of the men who would go out to keep the light on a far-off island 20 miles out to sea. Picture that building for a moment. 4 self-contained apartments, each with its own front door, arranged in a solid sandstone block looking out toward the water. Into those apartments, in the last months of the old century, 4 families moved their belongings. They hung curtains. They set up beds for their children. They began, in the careful and hopeful way that people do, to make a new place feel like home. They had barely had time to settle in. The lighthouse the men would serve had been operating for only a year. Everything about their situation was new. And among those families were the people whose lives this story is really about. Let's talk about James Ducat first, because he was the principal keeper, the man in charge, and because he had been with this particular lighthouse longer than anyone. James Ducat was 43 years old in the winter of 1900. He came originally from Arbroath, a fishing and weaving town on the east coast of Scotland, and by the time of these events, he had given roughly 2 decades of his life to the lighthouse service. 20 years, which is to say that lighthouse keeping was not a job he had stumbled into. It was his trade, his vocation, the thing he was good at, and the service trusted him with one of its most demanding and remote stations. He was a married man, and he had 4 children. 4 children who lived in that new sandstone house at Breskleet, who would have watched their father pack his things and leave for weeks at a time, and who would have watched the horizon for the boat that brought him home. When the lighthouse on the island was still under construction, it was James Ducat who had been chosen to oversee the work of getting it lit before the winter closed in. He had spent something like 14 months out on that rock in total. He knew the island better than almost anyone alive. He knew its moods, its landings, its weather, and he knew, better than most, exactly how dangerous it could be. There's a small, human detail that survives about James Ducat, and it is one of the saddest in the whole story, although we will come back to it properly later. Not long before he disappeared, he had spoken to his superintendent about the signals the keepers used to communicate with the shore. He had wondered aloud how quickly a signal would be noticed if he ever needed to raise one. He wondered how fast help would come. It was an idle conversation, the kind of thing a careful man says about his work. But knowing what we know now, it is hard not to hear something else in it. Now picture the second man, Thomas Marshall. He was the youngest of the 3, 28 years old, the second assistant keeper. Of the 3 men, the records tell us the least about Thomas Marshall's inner life, which is its own kind of sadness because he was so young. 28. He had, by all accounts, his whole working life still in front of him. He was the junior of the senior pair, the man learning the rhythms of the most exposed station in the service, under the eye of a principal keeper who had been doing the job since before Marshall was old enough to hold it. We know he came to the island to do good and serious work. We know he was trusted with it, and we know that whatever future he might have had, it ended somewhere on that island in the space of a single afternoon. And then there was the third man, the one whose presence on the island that December was, in a sense, an accident of scheduling. Donald McArthur. He was around 40 years old, a married man, and he lived not in the big house itself, but in a house nearby in Breskleet with his own family. McArthur was what the service called an occasional keeper. He was not permanently assigned to the Flannan Isles. He was there that month because the first assistant keeper, a man named William Ross, was on extended sick leave, and someone had to take his place. So Donald McArthur stepped in. He went out to the rock to fill a gap, to do another man's duty, the way working people have always covered for one another. McArthur is described in some accounts as an old soldier, a former military man, the sort who had seen hard places before and was not easily rattled. That detail matters, and it will matter a great deal when we come to the evidence because of one small thing that was found in his room. But we will get there. For now, hold on to this. Donald McArthur was on that island doing a favor, in effect. covering a colleague's shift. He was not even supposed to be there. 3 men then. James Ducat, the seasoned principal keeper with 20 years behind him and 4 children at home. Thomas Marshall, 28, the youngest, with everything ahead of him. And Donald McArthur, the old soldier standing in for a sick friend. Between Ducat and McArthur alone, there were 2 wives who would become widows and 6 children who would grow up without a father. That is the human weight of this story, and it is worth carrying it with us from the start before we ever get to the strange and unanswerable parts, because the strangeness is what made this case famous, but the men are what make it matter. To understand what their lives were actually like, we have to talk about the work itself, because lighthouse keeping in that era was unlike almost any other job in the world. A lighthouse keeper's first duty, the one that everything else served, was the light. Every evening, at a set time, the lamp had to be lit. Through the night it had to be watched, its mechanism wound, its flame and its fuel tended so that it never failed and never dimmed. In the morning, it was extinguished and cleaned. The great lens, a beautiful and intricate thing of polished glass, had to be kept spotless. The brass had to be polished. The oil fountains had to be filled. There was a logbook to keep and a slate on which the readings of the day were noted before they were copied over. The barometer, the thermometer, the state of the wind and the sea. It was methodical, repetitive, demanding work, and the whole point of it was that it never stopped. A light that fails for a single night might be the difference between a ship coming safely into port and a ship breaking apart on rocks in the dark. You worked in shifts, watch and watch about, sharing the long nights. You cooked and you cleaned and you maintained the station and you waited. And on a rock like the Flannan Isles, you did all of this in almost total isolation, cut off from the rest of the world by 20 miles of open Atlantic for weeks at a stretch, in some of the worst weather in Britain. You're standing on that island on an ordinary evening in the autumn of 1900. The light is beginning to fade over the water. You can hear the sea working at the base of the cliffs far below, a sound so constant that after a while you stop hearing it at all. Behind you, the white tower of the lighthouse rises against a darkening sky, and in a few minutes you will climb the stairs inside it and light the lamp, the way you have done every night you have been here. There is the smell of paraffin and polished brass. There is the wind, always the wind. And there is the knowledge, quiet and steady at the back of your mind, that the nearest other human being is a long, cold sea away. This was their normal. This was the ordinary world of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur. And it was about to become the setting for one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of the sea. Let's talk about the place itself, because the Flannan Isles are not like anywhere most of us will ever go, and the nature of the island is woven into everything that happened there. The Flannan Isles are a small, scattered group of rocky islets lying about 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, out in the grey water of the Atlantic, beyond the last of the inhabited land. They are sometimes called the Seven Hunters, an old name with a strange ring to it. They are green on top, where grass grows thin over the rock, and sheer at the edges, where the land simply stops and drops away into the sea. The largest of them is called Eilean Mor, which in Gaelic means simply the Big Island. And it is on Eilean Mor that this story takes place. Even by Hebridean standards, Eilean Mor was considered a place apart. For centuries, the only regular visitors were shepherds who would bring sheep across from Lewis to graze the rich grass during the summer months. The grazing was good. The island had a reputation for it. But here is the thing that everyone who tells this story comes back to. And it is true, and it is worth sitting with. The shepherds would bring their animals over, and they would tend to them, and they would leave again before nightfall. They would not stay the night on the island, not for anything. There were old beliefs about Eilean Mor, the kind of beliefs that grow up around lonely places at the edge of the world. The island was said to be haunted, to be the home of spirits, to belong to something other than the living. The shepherds, who were practical, hard-working people not given to flights of fancy, observed these customs without much need to explain them. You did your work, and you left before dark, and you did not ask too many questions about why. There was even an old chapel on the island, a tiny ruined stone structure dedicated to St. Flannan, a 6th century Irish bishop who is said to have built it, and from whom the islands take their name. People would circle the chapel in a particular way, observe particular small rituals, and then go. Now, it is easy to make too much of this. Folklore attaches itself to remote places the way salt attaches itself to anything left near the sea. Plenty of lonely islands have ghost stories, and ghost stories do not make men vanish. But the reason the folklore matters here is not because we should believe it. It matters because, after these 3 men disappeared, that old reputation for strangeness came rushing back, and it shaped the way the world chose to remember the case. An island that people already believed was uncanny had now claimed 3 lives in a way no one could explain. The story almost wrote itself. And as we will see, much of what people now think they know about the Flannan Isles mystery is not fact at all. It is the legend that grew in the space where the facts ran out. But before there was a legend, there was an act of extraordinary engineering, because at the very end of the 19th century, someone decided that a light was needed on this haunted, sheer-sided, sea-battered rock, and not just any someone. Have you ever wondered who actually built the lighthouses that ring the Scottish coast? Those impossible white towers clinging to cliffs and reefs in the worst places the sea can offer? For the most part, the answer is a single family, the Stevensons. For more than a century, generation after generation, the Stevensons of Edinburgh built the lighthouses of Scotland, and they did it in places that should have been impossible to build anything at all. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was designed by David Allen Stevenson and his brother Charles, and it was, even by their standards, a hard one. Think about what they were trying to do. They needed to put a working lighthouse, with all its machinery and its fuel and its accommodation, on the top of a green island whose every approach was a cliff. There was no harbour, there was no beach, there was nowhere for a boat to simply pull up. Everything, every stone, every barrel of cement, every length of iron, every piece of the great lens had to be brought across 20 miles of open Atlantic and then somehow lifted from a pitching boat up a sheer rock face to the island above. So they built 2 landings on opposite sides of the island, so that whatever the weather and whatever direction the sea was running, there would usually be one side sheltered enough to use. There was the east landing and the west landing, and from each landing they cut steps and laid a railway, a small inclined tramway, up the face of the cliff, with cranes to haul material up from the boats below. The construction work took the best part of 4 years. Men lived out on that rock for long stretches to do it. And James Ducat, as we said, was among those who oversaw the final push to get the light working. The lighthouse was first lit in December of 1899, exactly 1 year, almost to the week, before the 3 keepers disappeared. The tower itself stands near the highest point of the island, something like 280 feet above the sea. The light it threw could be seen for miles, a steady, turning beam sweeping out over the water, a fixed point of safety in one of the emptiest and most dangerous stretches of sea around the British Isles. To the captains of ships crossing the North Atlantic, bound for the ports of Scotland, that light was not a curiosity or a landmark. It was a promise. It said, "Here is where the rocks are. Here is how you stay alive. Keep me on your beam and you will come home." And that promise depended entirely on 3 men, living alone on a haunted rock, tending a flame. Now picture the daily reality of that. The landings, the steps, the tramway, the cranes, all of it had to be maintained, and all of it took a constant beating from the sea. We are not talking about gentle waves lapping at a dock. We are talking about the full force of the open Atlantic in winter, arriving without anything to break it, throwing itself against the rock with a power that is genuinely difficult to imagine if you have not stood near it. The West Landing in particular was a hard and exposed place. The steps climbed steeply from the water. There was a crane platform set into the cliff at around 70 feet above the sea, and higher still, set into a crevice in the rock at about 110 feet above the waves. There was a wooden box where the keepers stored the ropes and tackle and mooring gear for that landing. 110 feet. Take a moment with that number, because it becomes important. That is the height of a 10-story building. That is where they kept their gear, well above anything the sea could reasonably be expected to reach. The men who built and worked this station were not careless. They put things where they would be safe. They understood the sea, and the fact that they understood it, and still put the box at 110 feet, tells you something about what they thought the sea could and could not do. You're a keeper coming off the relief boat at the West Landing on a calm day. You step from the heaving deck of the tender onto the wet stone steps, timing your jump to the rise and fall of the swell, because there is no other way to do it. You climb. The steps are steep and the rock is slick with spray and weed. There is an iron railing along the path to hold on to, fixed into the stone. You pass the crane platform. You keep climbing. By the time you reach the storage box in its crevice, you are high above the water, and the boat below you looks small, and the only sounds are the wind and the endless working of the sea against the rock. This was a routine part of the job, securing the gear, fetching the ropes, checking that the storm had not carried anything away. On a good day, it was simply hard work. On a bad day, it was something else entirely. The rhythm of life on the station was built around the relief. Every so often, the lighthouse tender, a steamship called the Hesperus, would make the crossing from the mainland, bringing supplies, bringing mail, bringing news from home, and rotating the keepers. One man would go ashore for his time off with his family at Briskleet, while another came out to take his place. The schedule was not always reliable, because everything depended on the weather, and the weather out there could shut the island off completely for days or weeks at a time. But the relief was the lifeline. It was the thread that connected the men on the rock to the world of the living. The last relief before our story properly begins took place on the 7th of December, 1900. and it was carried out under the eye of the man who would later be sent back to investigate the disaster, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, a man named Robert Muirhead. Muirhead knew these men. He had personally recommended them for this station because he believed they were among the best the service had. He had worked alongside them out on the rock during the summer of the construction, more than a month in their company, and he had formed a real respect for how they did their jobs. On the 7th of December, he shook each of their hands and wished them well, and then he left them to it. He would write, later, with a grief that comes through plainly even in the formal language of an official report, that he had the melancholy recollection of being the last person to shake their hands and bid them farewell. He did not know it then. To him, it was just another relief, another routine handshake, another goodbye of the kind he had said 100 times. But it was the last time anyone who lived would see James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur alive. So now, the stage is set. 3 men on a remote rock at the edge of the Atlantic, a brand new lighthouse on an island that the local people had feared for centuries, a vital light that ships depended on, kept by hand every single night, 2 landings carved into sheer cliffs, and a sea that could turn from a nuisance into a killer without warning. The relief boat had come and gone on the 7th of December. The next one was due before the year was out. In between those 2 dates, in the short, dark days just before Christmas, something happened on Eilean Mor that no one has ever fully been able to explain. And the first sign that anything was wrong came not from the island at all, but from a passing ship in the night. Let's talk about the last days, as carefully as the record allows. And the first thing to say is that we have to be honest about how little we truly know and how much of what people repeat about these final days was invented long after the fact. We will be careful to keep those 2 things separate because the men deserve the truth, not the legend. What we can say with confidence comes from a small number of documents written by people who were actually there in the days and weeks afterward, the telegram sent by the captain of the relief vessel, the letter written by the keeper who found the station empty, and the formal report compiled by Superintendent Muirhead after he came out to the island and examined everything for himself. These are the bedrock. Everything trustworthy in this story rests on them, and from them we can reconstruct a rough picture of the island's last normal days. After the relief on the 7th of December, the 3 men settled into their routine. The light was lit each night. The work was done each morning. We know the light was burning on the night of the 7th because it was seen from the shore. And here we need to introduce one more person, a quiet figure on the edge of this story who turns out to matter a great deal. On the mainland, the Northern Lighthouse Board kept a watch on the Flannan Light through a local man, a gamekeeper named Roderick Mackenzie, who lived at a place called Uig on the Isle of Lewis. His job, and in practice the job of his 2 teenage sons, was simple. Each night, when conditions allowed, they were to look across the water toward the Flannan Isles and note whether the light could be seen. They kept a record of it in a book. It was a modest arrangement, a gamekeeper and his boys watching for a distant light, but it is one of the few independent windows we have into what was happening out on that rock in December of 1900. And the record they kept is strange and, in hindsight, troubling. The light was seen on the 7th of December, the night of the relief. But then it was not seen on the 8th, nor the 9th, nor the 10th, nor the 11th. 4 nights, dark. Then, on the 12th of December, the light was seen again. And after the 12th, it was not seen again at all. Not until the 26th, the night it was finally relit by other hands. Now, before we read too much into that, we have to be fair to the facts. Mackenzie himself said, and Muirhead confirmed, that the Flannan light could often go unseen for 4 or 5 nights in a row, simply because of haze or low cloud or the ordinary thickness of the winter atmosphere over 20 miles of sea. The island was so far out that on many nights it was invisible from shore regardless of whether the lamp was burning. So a few dark nights were not, by themselves, a cause for alarm. They were normal. The watchers were used to it. But Mackenzie also admitted something else. He said that as the gap stretched on, he had begun to grow uneasy. He had started, in the nights before the relief, to get the help of local people to look, to strain their eyes across the water, hoping to catch the beam. The not seeing had gone on a little too long. The quiet had begun to feel like the wrong kind of quiet. He was, in his words, becoming anxious. And yet, crucially, no alarm was raised, because the system was not built to treat a missing light as an emergency. A missing light usually meant nothing more than weather. And so the days slipped by. This is one of the genuinely painful threads in the whole case, and it is worth pausing on gently, because it is a human failure rather than a supernatural one. To be fair to everyone involved, no one did anything wrong by the standards of the time. The gamekeeper watched as he was asked to. The board operated as it always had. The relief was scheduled as normal. But the design of the whole arrangement meant that 3 men could vanish from a rock in the sea, and the light could go dark for the better part of 2 weeks, and no one would come. Muirhead himself recognized this afterward, and we will come back to what he said about it, because it is one of the quietest and most decent passages in the entire record. So what was actually happening on the island during those days? Here we have to lean on the physical evidence that was found later because no living person witnessed it. When the station was finally examined, it was clear that the work of the keepers had continued in an orderly way right up to a certain point. The logbook, the formal record, had its last full entry on the 13th of December. But the keepers also kept a slate, on which they wrote the day's readings before transferring them neatly into the log. And on that slate, the readings continued past the 13th. There were particulars noted for the 14th of December, and there were readings taken on the morning of the 15th of December. The barometer, the thermometer, the state of the wind, written down at 9 in the morning, the way they were written down every single day. The last entry on the slate was made by James Ducat, the principal keeper, on the morning of Saturday, the 15th of December. And here is what the physical evidence showed about that morning, because this is how investigators were able to fix the time of the disappearance so precisely. The lamp had been cleaned and made ready for the coming night, what the keepers called crimming. The oil fountains and the canteens had been filled. The lens and the machinery had been wiped down and set in order. The pots and pans in the kitchen had been washed. The kitchen itself had been tidied. Every sign pointed to the same conclusion. The ordinary morning work of the 15th of December had been completed, fully and properly, by men who had every intention of being there that night to light the lamp. And then they were gone. Whatever happened, It happened in the afternoon of Saturday, the 15th of December, 1900. After the morning's work was done, after the slate was filled in, before the time came to light the lamp, somewhere in those few hours of fading winter daylight, all three men left the lighthouse, and none of them ever came back to light it. Now, what was the weather doing in those days? This is where the story has been heavily distorted over the years, so let us be careful. There certainly was rough weather in the North Atlantic around the middle of December. That is well established. The waters around the Flannan Isles in December are almost always rough, and the evidence found on the island afterward, which we will examine in detail, points to truly violent seas at some point, but the popular image of a single great howling storm raging on the very afternoon the men vanished, with the wind screaming and the waves towering, is not as cleanly supported by the record as the dramatic retellings suggest. The sea damage was real and severe. The precise weather at the precise hour is something we have to be more humble about. What we can say is this: the men finished their morning's work in good order. At some point on that Saturday afternoon, for reasons connected to the landings and the storm gear, two or possibly all three of them went out from the safety of the lighthouse and down toward the sea, and they did not return. The lamp was never lit on the night of the 15th, and from that night onward, the gamekeeper's sons strained their eyes toward a rock that gave back only darkness. Out on the shipping lanes, life went on, indifferent and unaware, and it was a passing ship that gave the first real sign that something had gone wrong, though by a cruel twist of timing, that warning would arrive far too late to matter. On the night of the 15th of December, a steamer called the Arctur was making the last leg of a long voyage. She had come from Philadelphia across the whole width of the Atlantic, bound for the port of Leith near Edinburgh. Her master was a Captain Holman, and in the dark, around midnight, the Arctur passed near the Flannan Isles on the route that thousands of ships took, the route that the Flannan Light existed to guard. And the light was not there. Captain Holman knew that light should have been burning. He knew the Flannan Isles lighthouse, knew where it stood and what its beam looked like. And on that night, looking out toward where the light should have been sweeping across the water, he saw nothing. He was troubled by it. He felt, in the way an experienced sailor feels these things, that something was wrong. He intended to report it the moment he reached port. A dark lighthouse, after all, is not just a curiosity. It is a danger to every ship that follows. But here, the story takes one of its small, devastating turns. The Arctur's warning did not get through, or at least not in time to do any good. By some accounts, the ship ran into difficulty herself, running aground in the Firth of Forth on her way in. The message, when it eventually reached anyone with the power to act, was delayed. The ship docked at Leith, and the report of the dark light was eventually passed along toward the Northern Lighthouse Board, but it arrived slowly, caught in the ordinary friction of communication in an age before any of the instant connections we take for granted. By the time it reached the people who could send help, the help was already on its way for an entirely different reason. The routine relief was due. Think about that for a moment, because it is one of the quietest tragedies in the case. A ship's captain, hundreds of miles away, saw the darkness on the very night it fell. He understood that it was wrong. He tried to raise the alarm. and it made no difference at all, because the world simply could not move fast enough. The men were almost certainly already lost by the time the archer passed, but even if some flicker of life had remained, even if there had been some faint chance, the warning came too slow to seize it. The light had gone out, and the only person who noticed in real time was a passing stranger who could do nothing but report it and sail on into the night. The relief itself, the visit that would finally bring people to the island, was also delayed, and again by the weather. The Hesperus, the lighthouse tender, had been due to sail toward the Flannan Isles around the 20th of December, but the sea would not allow it. The conditions were too bad to make the crossing safely, and so the relief was held back, day after day, as the short December days ticked toward Christmas. The men's families at Brestclet waited. The light stayed dark. The gamekeeper kept watching, and still no one knew. It was not until the day after Christmas, the 26th of December, 1900, that the Hesperus was finally able to make the crossing to Eilean Mor. On board was Captain Harvey, her master. On board, too, was a keeper named Joseph Mor, the man who was due to relieve one of the three on the rock and take his turn out at the station. Mor was the fourth keeper of the Flannan Isles establishment. He had a home and a family at the shore station. He had simply, by the luck of the rota, been ashore on his time off during the days when everything went wrong. He had no way of knowing what he was sailing toward. You're on the deck of the Hesperus that afternoon, as the island comes into view across the grey water. It is winter, and the light is already thin and failing. You have made this crossing before. You know the shape of Eilean Mor, the green crown of it, the white tower standing near the top, and as you draw closer, you start to look for the small, ordinary signs that everything is as it should be. The flag, raised to greet the relief boat, the figures of the keepers moving down toward the landing to meet you, the familiar choreography of a relief repeated 100 times before, but the flagstaff is bare. There is no flag, and there is no one on the landing, and as the ship works in closer toward that sheer, silent island, a feeling begins to settle over the men on deck, a cold unease that has nothing to do with the temperature of the air. Something is wrong here. Something is very wrong. And in a few minutes, Joseph Mor is going to climb out of the boat and up the steps and through a closed door, and he is going to become the first living man to walk into the silence that the three keepers left behind. Now picture the scene exactly as it unfolded, because for the next part of the story, we are lucky enough to have the words of a man who was actually there, who wrote down what he found within days of finding it, while it was still raw. His name was Joseph Mor, and the letter he wrote to his superiors is one of the most quietly heartbreaking documents in the whole record. We are going to follow it closely because Joseph Mor deserves to tell this part himself, and because his account is the truth, free of the embroidery that came later. When the Hesperus came to anchor under the island that afternoon, and there was no flag, and no answer to the ship's horn, sounded again and again across the water, Captain Harvey did what a careful master does. He fired a rocket, a signal that should have brought the keepers running to the landing. Nothing, no response, no movement on the green slopes above. Just the island, and the sea, and the silence. Harvey decided to put a man ashore, if it could be done at all. The east landing was the only one usable that day, and even there the sea made it difficult. The boat was worked carefully in toward the steps, backed into the landing on the swell, and Joseph Mor, with some difficulty, managed to jump from the boat onto the wet stone. The others stayed in the boat below. Mor went up alone. He climbed the steps, the same 160 steps the keepers climbed every day, up toward the station, and the first thing he came to was the entrance gate to the compound. It was closed. He went on to the entrance door, the outer door that led toward the kitchen and the storeroom. That was closed too, and the inner door beyond it. But the kitchen door itself, the innermost one, stood open. He stepped into the kitchen, and he looked the way you would look at the fireplace, and he saw that the fire had not been lit for days. The hearth was cold, old ashes long dead, in a place where a fire was life itself, where it meant warmth and cooked food and the simple comfort of a flame on a winter day. The fire had been out for a long time. Mor moved through the rooms one after another, the bedrooms, and the beds were empty, not stripped, not disturbed in any dramatic way, but empty, left, in Mor's own description, just as the men had risen from them in the early morning. The beds of men who had got up one morning, made ready for the day, and never come back to sleep in them again. There was a clock on the wall, and it had stopped. This detail is in the primary record, in Captain Harvey's telegram, and in Muirhead's report, and it is real. The clock had wound down and stopped, the way a clock does when there is no one left to wind it, ticking out the last of its tension into an empty room, and then falling silent. By the time Mor stood in that kitchen, the clock had been stopped for days. It had quietly kept the only record of how long the men had been gone, and then it too had given up. Joseph Mor did not linger. He wrote afterward that he did not take the time to search further, because he already knew in his gut that something serious had happened. He turned and ran back down to the landing. He called out to the men in the boat that the place was deserted, and one of them, the second mate, a man named McCormack, came up with him a second time, the two of them going back over the station together, because the first look had been so impossible to believe that they had to make sure. But the second look only confirmed the first. The men were gone, all three of them. Ducat, Marshall, McArthur, gone. Now, this is the moment to pause and be honest with you about something, because if you have heard this story before, you have almost certainly heard details that I have not just mentioned. You may have heard that there was a meal left half-eaten on the table, that a plate of food sat going cold meat and pickles and potatoes, that a chair was lying overturned on the floor, knocked back as if a man had leapt up from it in sudden alarm. These images are vivid. They are the heart of how almost everyone pictures the scene, and we have to talk about them carefully, because the truth matters here, especially when we are talking about real men and not characters in a ghost story. Those details are not in the primary record. They are not in Joseph Mor's letter, written days after he stood in that kitchen. They are not in Captain Harvey's telegram. They are not in Superintendent Muirhead's careful report. The overturned chair, the meal on the table, the food going cold, all of it appears to have entered the story later, most famously through a poem written about the disappearance 12 years afterward, in 1912, by a writer named Wilfrid Wilson Gibson. Gibson was not there. He was imagining the scene, as a poet does, reaching for images that would make a reader feel the strangeness of it. And his images were so good, so haunting, that over the following century they slowly hardened into fact in the public mind. People stopped being able to tell the poem from the report. To be fair, we should not be too hard on this. It is a natural thing. A poem captures a feeling. The feeling gets repeated, and after enough repetitions, it becomes part of the story. But it means that one of the most famous things everyone knows about the Flannan Isles mystery, the eerie tableau of the abandoned meal and the toppled chair, almost certainly never existed. What Joseph Mor actually found was quieter, and in its own way, far sadder. Not a scene of violent interruption, but a scene of ordinary order. A station where the morning's work had been done properly. A kitchen that had been tidied, pots and pans washed and put away, beds left as men leave them when they rise for the day, a cold hearth, a stopped clock, and no one there. It was not the scene of a struggle. It was the scene of an absence. 3 men had completed their morning, walked out of that lighthouse on a winter afternoon, and the door had closed behind them, and the silence had simply moved in and taken their place. The lightroom itself, when Moore and McCormack went up to it, was in perfect order. The lamp was clean, the fountain was full, the blinds were down over the windows as they should be in the daytime to protect the lens. Everything in that room was exactly as it ought to be, made ready for a light that was never lit. Whatever had taken the men, it had not touched their work. They had done their duty right up to the last hour they were on that island. The machinery was sound. The lamp wanted only a hand to light it. There was simply no hand left to do it. Captain Harvey understood at once what this meant and what it did not mean. It did not mean an answer. It meant only a terrible, open question. He could not stay. The winter night was coming on. The sea was dangerous, and he could not leave the station dark a single night longer, because every dark night was a danger to ships. So he made a decision that says a great deal about the men of that service. He asked for volunteers to stay behind on the island, on that empty rock where 3 men had just vanished, to keep the light burning until proper arrangements could be made. And men volunteered. Joseph Mor, of course, who was due to take up duty there anyway. The boymaster, a man named Alan MacDonald, who happened to be aboard, and 2 seamen from the crew, named Lamont and Campbell. 4 men agreed to stay alone on Eilean Mor in the dark days after Christmas, in the very place that had just swallowed 3 of their colleagues without explanation, so that the light would not fail. They went ashore. They climbed up to the lightroom, and that night, at the proper time, they lit the lamp, and it has burned every night since, through all the long years that followed. There is something in that act that I find genuinely moving and worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is so far from the sensational way this story is usually told. These were not heroes in any grand sense. They were working men doing their jobs, but to stay on that island that night, knowing what had happened there, knowing that 3 of your own had walked out and not come back, and to light the light anyway because ships needed it, because that was the whole point. That was the entire reason the station existed, the safety of all. That takes a particular kind of quiet courage. The dead keepers would have understood it perfectly. It was the same courage their own work had required, every single night, for as long as they had served. Captain Harvey then took the Hesperus back toward the mainland and to a telegraph office at Breskleet, and he sent the message that would carry the news to the world. His telegram is short, and it is plain, and the grief in it is unmistakable underneath the formal words. He reported that a dreadful accident had happened at the Flannans, that the three keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the occasional keeper, had disappeared from the island, that on the ship's arrival there was no sign of life to be seen, that a rocket had been fired and brought no response, that Mor had gone up and found no keepers, the clocks stopped, and other signs that the accident must have happened about a week before. And then, in the middle of all that careful officialese, a phrase that breaks through it completely. "Poor fellows," he wrote. "They must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. Poor fellows." 2 words in a telegram from a ship's captain who had just confronted an impossible scene and would now have to carry the news to 2 waiting widows and their children. Poor fellows. It is the most human moment in the entire official record, and it tells you that the men who dealt with this firsthand were not thinking about mystery or legend or anything strange at all. They were thinking about 3 colleagues they had lost, and the families those colleagues had left behind. The strangeness came later, from people who were far away. The people who were actually there felt only grief and the cold, practical urgency of keeping a light lit on a winter sea. But Captain Harvey's telegram was only the first word. It would fall to another man, a man who knew the 3 keepers personally, who had recommended them for this very station, who had shaken their hands less than 3 weeks before, to come out to the island himself and try to piece together what had actually happened, and what Superintendent Robert Muirhead found when he climbed down toward the West Landing in the last days of December was a story written not in words, but in twisted iron and scattered rope and the brute evidence of what the sea is capable of. Let's talk about Robert Muirhead, because the investigation of this case rests almost entirely on his shoulders, and because of all the people connected to the story. He may be the one who cared the most. Muirhead was the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board. He was the man who had personally selected James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur for the Flannan Isles, because in his judgment they were among the very best men the service had. He had spent over a month living and working alongside them during the summer of 1899, when everyone labored hard to get the station lit before winter. He had visited them on the relief of the 7th of December. He had, as he put it himself, shaken their hands and bid them farewell, never imagining it was the last time. When the news came, it came to a man who was not just an administrator filing a report. It came to a man who had lost colleagues he respected and in some real sense friends. He made the practical arrangements first, the way a responsible man does, even in grief. He reorganized the staffing so the light would be covered. He sent experienced keepers to take temporary charge, and then, as soon as he could, he went out to the island himself. He was landed on Eilean Mor early on the 29th of December, 3 days after the discovery, to find out, if it was at all possible to find out, what had happened to his men. He began methodically. He satisfied himself that the light was in good order and that the men he had brought could keep it running. Then he set about examining the island itself, taking statements from everyone involved, from Captain Harvey, from the second mate McCormack, from Joseph Moore, from the buoy master MacDonald. He walked the ground, and what he found tells a story, even though it is a story without an ending. The East Landing, where Moore had come ashore, was untouched. Everything there was in order. The ropes that had been coiled and stored after the relief on the 7th of December were all still in their places, exactly as they had been left. Whatever had happened to the three men, it had not happened at the East Landing, and they had not been taken from there. The buildings of the station were in order. The lighthouse itself was sound. The disaster, whatever it was, had left almost the entire island looking perfectly normal. Almost the entire island, because the West Landing was a different matter entirely. The West Landing, you will remember, was the harder and more exposed of the two, the one that took the full force of the Atlantic from the west. And when Muirhead made his way down toward it, he saw at once that something violent had occurred there. He could not get all the way down to the landing itself because of the sea that was still running, but he got down to the crane platform, 70 feet above the water, and from there he could read the evidence. The crane itself, the one that had been newly installed that summer, was safe. It was unharmed. Its jib had been lowered and secured to the rock, and the canvas covering the wire rope on its barrel was still lashed neatly around it. There was no sign that the men had been working at the crane, no half-finished task, no gear left out as if abandoned mid-job. The crane told its own small story. Whatever the men had come down to do, it does not seem to have been about the crane. But all around that orderly crane, there was chaos. And it was the particular kind of chaos that only the sea can make. Remember the wooden box, the one that held the mooring ropes and the landing tackle and the crane handles, the box that had been secured in a crevice in the rock 110 feet above the level of the sea. It was gone, washed clean away from its place at 110 feet. The ropes that had been inside it were strewn through the crevices of the rocks near the crane platform, tangled among the legs of the crane. The gear that had been stored carefully and high, well above anything anyone thought the sea could reach, had been ripped out and scattered down the cliff. The iron railings, the solid metal rails fixed into the rock along the path from the tramway down toward the landing, and the railings around the crane platform were displaced and twisted, bent, torn from their foundations in places. The handrail that the men used to make the boat's mooring rope fast was entirely carried away, simply gone. This was iron, set into stone, built to withstand the worst that the location could offer, and it had been wrenched apart like wire. And then there was the stone. Muirhead recorded that a single block of stone, weighing upward of 200 weight, had been dislodged from its place higher up and carried down, left lying on the concrete path near the top of the steps. Let us be clear about what that means. 20 hundredweight is more than a ton, more than the weight of a small car. A block of solid rock, heavier than a ton, had been picked up by the sea and moved, not chipped, not cracked, moved, carried from one place to another by water. But of all the things Muirhead found at the West Landing, there is one that, to me, says more about the raw power of what happened there than anything else. There was a life buoy fastened to the railings along the path, kept there for use in an emergency, the way you would keep a life ring near any dangerous water. And the life buoy was gone. At first, Muirhead thought perhaps one of the men had taken it down to use, that it had been removed deliberately in some attempt at rescue. It would have been a natural thing to grab. But when he examined the ropes that had held it in place, he found they had not been untied. They had not been touched by any human hand. Instead, there were pieces of canvas still clinging to those ropes, torn fragments of the life buoy's covering. The sea had not untied the life buoy. The sea had torn it off, ripped it away from its fastenings with such force that it left shreds of itself behind on the ropes. And it had done this, Muirhead noted, at a height of 110 feet above the level of the sea. Sit with that for a moment, because it is genuinely hard to comprehend. The force of water pouring up and over and through that landing was great enough, at 110 feet above the waves, to tear a lifebuoy from iron railings and leave only rags behind. Whatever struck the west landing of Eilean Mor on or around the 15th of December, 1900, was not an ordinary storm wave. It was something far beyond that. A wall of water rising up the face of the cliff to a height most of us would associate with the upper floors of a tall building, and arriving with a violence that bent iron and moved stone weighing more than a ton. This is the physical heart of the case. This is what the island gave up in place of the bodies it never returned. Not an answer exactly, but a force, a measurable, terrible, undeniable force. And then there was the matter of the clothing, which is the detail that has haunted everyone who has ever studied this case, because it is the one place where the evidence almost seems to whisper a story. When the station was searched, the keeper's outdoor clothing was accounted for in a very particular way. The keepers had heavy weather gear that they wore only when they went down to the landings, the dangerous, exposed, soaking work at the edge of the sea, sea boots, oilskins, waterproofs. Joseph Moore, who knew these men and knew their habits, was clear about this. They put on that gear only when they were going down to the water. James Ducat's sea boots were gone, and his waterproof was gone. He had taken them. Thomas Marshall's sea boots were gone, and his oilskins were gone. He had taken them too, so both Ducat and Marshall had dressed for the landing. They had put on the heavy weather gear that they only ever wore when they were going down toward the sea, which means almost certainly that they had left the lighthouse intending to go down to one of the landings dressed for the worst of it. But Donald McArthur had not. McArthur's outdoor coat, the heavy coat he wore when he went down to the landings, the only such coat Moore had ever known him to use, was still hanging in the station. He had left it behind, which means that when Donald McArthur, the old soldier, walked out of that lighthouse for the last time, he was not dressed for the sea. He went out, as Moore put it, in his shirt sleeves. Have you ever wondered what could make a man run out of a warm building into the teeth of an Atlantic winter, toward the most dangerous edge of a dangerous island without stopping to put on his coat? A careful man, a military man, a man who, by every account, knew exactly what that weather could do and would never normally have gone near the landings without his proper gear. What could make a man like that leave his coat on its hook and go out into the cold in his shirt sleeves? There is an answer that suggests itself, and it is the most human answer in the whole case, and we are going to look at it closely. But it is, in the end, only a theory. The truth is that the coat on its hook is one more silent fact, like the moved stone and the torn lifebuoy and the cold hearth. And the island offered up these facts the way it offered up everything else, without explanation, without a single word about what they meant. Robert Muirhead gathered all of it: the orderly east landing and the wrecked west landing, the vanish box at 110 feet, the scattered but still coiled ropes, the bent iron and the moved stone and the shredded lifebuoy, the two men dressed for the sea, and the one man who went out without his coat. He weighed all of it as carefully as any man could, and then he sat down to write his report, and to do the one thing that no amount of evidence could really make possible. He tried to say what had happened to his 3 men. Let's talk about the theories now, and let's do it the way the case deserves, which means separating what the evidence can actually support from what people have wished into the empty space where the answer should be, because over the past century, a great many explanations have been offered for what happened to these 3 men. Some of them are sober and grounded and worth taking seriously. Some of them are wild inventions, and the men themselves deserve to have their disappearance considered honestly, not turned into a carnival. We will start with the explanation given by the one man who actually stood on that island, examined the evidence with his own eyes, knew the keepers personally, and had no reason to invent anything. Robert Muirhead. After his careful examination of the west landing, the railings, the ropes, the moved stone, the torn lifebuoy, and after weighing all the evidence he could gather, Muirhead came to a conclusion that he stated plainly. In his opinion, the most likely explanation was this. The 3 men had all gone down on the afternoon of Saturday the 15th of December to the area near the west landing in order to secure the box of mooring ropes and tackle. And while they were down there, an unexpectedly large roller, a great wave far bigger than the seas around it, had come up onto the island. A huge body of water had risen up higher than where the men were standing and then come crashing down upon them and swept them away with a force that nothing could resist. That is the official conclusion. A freak wave. A rogue roller of the kind that the open Atlantic occasionally produces, far larger than its neighbors, arriving without warning. It fits the physical evidence remarkably well. It explains the wrecked west landing, while the rest of the island stood untouched. It explains how iron could be bent and a stone of more than a ton could be moved, and a life buoy could be torn away at 110 feet. It explains why no bodies were ever found, because men swept off that landing into that sea, in that season, would simply be gone, carried out into the deep water and lost. And it explains why the men were where they were, doing the work they had every reason to be doing after a spell of bad weather, checking and securing the storm-damaged gear at the most exposed landing. Muirhead also did something that good investigators do. He considered the obvious alternative and explained why he rejected it. There was a theory, even at the time, that the men might simply have been blown off the cliffs by the wind, which was certainly strong. But Muirhead pointed out a problem with that. The wind that day was a westerly, coming in off the sea from the west. If the wind had caught the men and blown them, it would have blown them inland, up and across the island, away from the edge. It would not have carried them out to sea. And he felt certain that 3 experienced men, caught by a gust on open ground, would have thrown themselves flat long before they reached the high brow of the island. The geometry was wrong for the wind theory. The water was the more likely killer. So that is the official explanation, and it remains, more than a century later, the most credible single account of what happened. A wave. The sea doing what the sea does, on a day when 3 men were in the wrong place at the wrong moment. But the official explanation leaves one thing unexplained, and it is the thing we keep coming back to. Donald McArthur's coat still hanging on its hook. If all 3 men went down to the landing together to secure the box, dressed for the work, then why did 2 of them put on their heavy weather gear while the 3rd went out in his shirt sleeves? It does not fit. A careful man going down to that landing would dress for it. MacArthur knew the danger as well as anyone. So why did he leave without his coat? This is where a second theory comes in, and it is not really a rival to Muirhead's so much as a refinement of it, a small adjustment that makes the whole picture click into a shape that feels painfully human. And it goes like this. Suppose that two of the men, Ducat and Marshall, went down to the west landing to deal with the storm gear, dressed properly for it, in their boots and their oilskins and their waterproofs. And suppose that the third man, Donald McArthur, stayed behind at the lighthouse, perhaps on watch, perhaps simply keeping out of the weather, with no intention of going down to the sea, which is why his coat was still on its hook. And suppose that from somewhere up above, from the lighthouse or the high ground, MacArthur saw something, saw the two men in trouble, saw a great wave coming, or saw his colleague struck and in the water, or saw some sudden danger unfolding at the landing below. What does a man do in that moment? An old soldier, a man trained to act, watching two of his colleagues in mortal danger. He does not stop to put on his coat. He does not pause for anything. He runs. He throws open the door and runs down toward the sea in his shirt sleeves to help, to pull them out, to do whatever he can. And he arrives at exactly the wrong moment, just as the next great wave, or the same one, comes up the rock. And it takes him too. I want to be careful here, because this is a theory, not a fact, and we have promised to keep those things separate. There is no proof of this sequence of events. No one saw it. It is a reconstruction built around a single detail, the coat on the hook. But it is a reconstruction that fits every piece of physical evidence we have, and it does something the bare official version does not. It restores the men to themselves. It says that the last act of Donald MacArthur's life may have been to run, unprotected, into the worst the sea could offer, to try to save two men he worked beside. It says that these were not victims who stumbled into danger through carelessness, but men who, in their final moments, may have been doing exactly what the best of us would hope to do, looking out for each other. To be fair, we cannot know that this is what happened, but of all the explanations, it is the one that treats the men with the most dignity, and it asks no more of the evidence than the evidence already offers. Now, having given the grounded theories their due, we have to talk about the other kind, because they are a huge part of why this case became famous, and because some of them, if we are not careful, quietly insult the three men at the center of it. Let's start with the famous logbook entries, because they are the foundation of almost every spooky retelling of this story, and because they are, as far as the historical record can tell, simply not real. If you have read about the Flannan Isles before, you have probably encountered a series of dramatic diary or logbook entries supposedly written by the keepers in their final days, entries describing a terrible storm raging around the island, an entry noting that James Ducat had become irritable, that another keeper had been crying, that Donald McArthur, the hardened old soldier, was weeping, and a final entry that read, "The storm had ended, the sea was calm, and God was over all." It is wonderfully eerie. It suggests three men slowly losing their composure in the grip of something they could not name, something that frightened even a soldier to tears, before they vanished into a calm that should have meant safety. It is also almost certainly a complete fabrication. These entries do not appear in the official record, the national records of Scotland, which holds the surviving documents of the Lighthouse commissioners, has stated plainly that it does not even possess the logbook for the Flannan Isles lighthouse. It was not among the records handed over, so the source for these supposedly verbatim entries is a mystery in itself, and what we can say is that they have all the hallmarks of later invention, the work of writers embellishing the story to make it more frightening. And there is a deeper problem with them. The entries describe a man crying, a hardened soldier reduced to weeping by fear days before the men vanished. But there was no exceptional storm recorded on the island in the way the entries claim, and the keeper's actual recorded work shows 3 calm, competent professionals doing their jobs in good order right up to the morning of the 15th. The slate readings are mundane weather notes, not a descent into terror. Why does this matter so much? Because those invented entries do something quietly unkind. They turn 3 steady, capable working men into characters in a horror story, men who cracked, who wept, who lost their nerve. There is no evidence any of that happened. Everything we actually know suggests the opposite. These were men who completed their morning's work properly, cleaned their equipment, filled their lamps, tidied their kitchen, and then went out to do a hard and necessary job, and were killed doing it. They did not fall apart. The fiction says they did, and the fiction has been repeated so often that many people now believe it. The men deserve better than to be remembered for emotions they were invented to have. And then there are the theories that go further still, out past the edge of anything the evidence can hold. Over the years, people have suggested that the keepers were carried off by a sea monster, that they were taken by a ghost ship, that they were snatched by enormous birds, that they were abducted by something not of this world, that foreign spies spirited them away. These ideas trace back, in part, to that old reputation of the island as a haunted place, the one the shepherds feared, and in part to the simple human hunger for a story big enough to match the strangeness of 3 men vanishing without a trace. We can mention these theories because they are part of the story's long afterlife, but there is nothing to support any of them, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. The torn life buoy at 110 feet does not need a monster to explain it. The sea is enough. There is one more theory we should address, the darkest one, because it is sometimes raised, and it does the men a particular disservice. It is the idea that one of the keepers killed the other 2 in a fit of madness brought on by isolation, and then took his own life by walking into the sea. This theory leans heavily on those invented logbook entries, the supposed irritability and weeping as evidence of cracking minds. But the entries are fiction, as we have seen, so the foundation of the theory crumbles. There is no physical evidence of violence anywhere on the island. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no weapon, nothing in any of the first-hand accounts to suggest one man harmed another. The scene Joseph Moore actually found was not a scene of violence. It was a scene of orderly absence. To accuse one of these 3 men of murdering his colleagues with no evidence at all, simply because the truth is unbearable to leave open, is to add a second injustice on top of the first. We are not going to do that to them. There is no reason to believe any one of them was anything other than a victim of the sea, alongside the others. So where does that leave us? It leaves us, honestly, with the sea. The overwhelming weight of the actual evidence points to what Muir had concluded in 1901, and what every sober student of the case has concluded Since 3 men went down toward the West Landing on a December afternoon to do the dangerous work their station required, and a great wave took them. Whether all 3 went down together or whether one ran after the others to help, we cannot say for certain, and we never will. But the killer was not a monster or a ghost or one of their own. It was the same Atlantic that they had served against every night with a single faithful light for as long as they had been on that rock. And on the 15th of December 1900, it simply took them. That is the most likely truth. But the most likely truth is not the same as a known truth, and it is worth being honest about the difference. We do not actually know what happened on Eilean Mor that afternoon. We have evidence, and we have the best reconstruction the evidence will bear, and we have the quiet, decent conclusion of a man who loved his keepers and wanted only to understand. But no one saw it. No one survived it. The sea kept its account to itself. And so, more than a century later, the honest words remain the hardest ones. We do not know. We will probably never know. And the 3 men are still out there, somewhere in that grey water where no one has ever found them. Let's talk about what came after, because a disappearance like this does not end when the investigation closes. It goes on living in the people who are left behind, and it went on living in that small village on the Isle of Lewis for the rest of their lives. When Robert Muirhead finished his inquiry on the island, he wired his conclusions back to the board, and then he did something that was not part of any official duty, but that tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He went to Breescleet, to the shore station and the village around it, and he called on the widows, on the wife of James Ducat, the principal keeper who now had 4 children and no husband, and on the wife of Donald McArthur, the occasional keeper, the old soldier who had only been out on that rock because he was covering for a sick colleague. Try to imagine those visits. A man arriving at the door, a man the family knew, a man who had recommended their husband and father for the very posting that had killed him. He could not bring them a body. He could not bring them certainty. He could not even bring them the small mercy of a single eyewitness who could say, "This is how it happened. This is what he was doing. It was quick. He did not suffer long." He could bring them only his careful reconstruction, his deep regret, and the unbearable open space where an answer should have been. Whatever he said in those rooms, it was not recorded, and it should not have been. But he went. He sat with them. And then he carried his grief back into his formal report, where it surfaces in lines that no amount of official language can quite contain. He wrote of his deep regret. He wrote that the board had lost 2 of its most efficient keepers and a competent occasional. He wrote that he had known Ducat and Marshall intimately, and MacArthur well. He wrote of being the last man to shake their hands. This was not an administrator covering himself. This was a man in mourning, doing his job through it. The families at Breescleet had barely had time to make that village home. Remember, the shore station, the big house, was only a year old. The families had only newly moved in. They had hung their curtains and arranged their rooms and begun to settle into a new life built entirely around the lighthouse and its rhythms, the leaving and the returning, the boat on the horizon, the reunions. And then, before that life had even properly begun, 2 of those families were broken in a single afternoon by a sea 20 miles away that no one could even see from the village windows. The houses they had moved into with such hope became the houses where they waited for men who would never come home. And there is a particular cruelty in the not knowing that I want to name gently, because it is the heart of what these families had to carry. When someone dies, there is a body and a grave and a place to bring your grief. There is a funeral, there is a date and a fact and an end. The families of James Ducat and Donald McArthur and Thomas Marshall got none of that. There was no body to bury. There was no grave to visit. There was no place on the earth where they could stand and say, "Here is where he rests." The sea had taken the men and given nothing back, not even the small terrible comfort of a death you can be certain of. For the rest of their lives, the people who loved these three men had to live inside a question, and the question never closed. Let's talk about Joseph Mor for a moment too, because he carried his own version of this. Mor was the man who climbed those steps alone and walked into the empty station, the first living person to confront the silence, and it shook him badly. Muirhead noticed it. He wrote in his report that Mor was naturally very much upset by the occurrence and appeared very nervous, and that because of this, he had arranged for one of the seamen, Lamont, to stay on the island with Mor for a week or two, to go up to the light room and keep him company during his watches. Think about the tenderness in that small arrangement. A man who had to keep living and working on the very rock where he had found his colleagues gone, doing the night watches alone in the dark, in the light room with the sea below. And his superintendent, understanding what that would do to a person, quietly made sure he would not have to be alone with it. Muirhead even noted that if Mor's nervousness did not pass, he would have to be transferred, though he was reluctant to lose a man who knew the station so well. We do not know how long it took Joseph Mor to be able to climb those stairs without remembering, but we know that someone made sure he did not have to climb them alone. Out of the whole tragedy, Muirhead drew one practical lesson, and it is worth telling, because it shows him trying to wring some small good from the loss. He recognized that the system of watching for the light had failed the men. The gamekeeper and his sons had done their part, but there was no procedure that treated a long dark light as an emergency. The light had been out for the better part of 2 weeks, and no one had come. Muirhead recommended a change, that in future the signalman watching from shore should be instructed to report it to the authorities whenever the light failed to appear when, in his judgment, it ought to have been seen. It was a modest recommendation. It would not have saved these three men, and Muirhead knew it, and said so plainly. By the time the light went dark, the men were almost certainly already gone. But it might, in some future case, have meant that a dark light brought people sooner. He was thinking, even in his grief, about the next three men, and the ones after them. He also weighed and then set aside an idea that had been raised, the idea of a daily signal from the island meaning all is well. He decided against it, and his reasoning is quietly devastating. Such a signal, he explained, would often be invisible from shore for days at a time, simply because of haze and distance and the ordinary murk over the island. An all-is-well signal that could not be seen would not reassure anyone. It would only cause needless alarm, especially among the keepers' wives and families, who would watch for it and not see it and fear the worst on nights when nothing at all was wrong. He had thought about the families. He had thought about the women in that village, standing at their windows, looking for a sign across 20 miles of water, and he decided not to give them a signal that would torment them on every hazy night. There is a great deal of humanity in that decision, hidden inside a dry administrative paragraph. The light itself never stopped. That is the thing that I find quietly remarkable about this whole story. From the night Joseph Moore and the volunteers relit it on the 26th of December, the Flannan Isles lighthouse went on burning. New keepers came to take up the duty. The station went on doing exactly what it had been built to do, guiding ships safely past the rocks, night after night after night, for decade after decade. The men who came after Ducat and Marshall and MacArthur climbed the same 160 steps, trimmed the same kind of lamp, kept the same kind of watch. The work the three men died doing was carried on by other hands, faithfully for 70 more years. The lighthouse was finally automated in 1971, its keepers withdrawn, its light from then on tended by machines. But the light is still there. It still turns over that grey water every night. The names of the men changed, and then there were no men at all. But the promise the light makes to ships at sea, the promise these three died keeping, has never once been broken. Now, we have to talk about the legend, because the strange afterlife of this story is itself part of the story, and because it has not always served the three men well. The disappearance captured the public imagination almost at once, and it never let go. The image of three men vanishing from a sealed island, leaving a stopped clock and a cold hearth behind, was simply too haunting to stay quiet. In 1912, the poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson published a poem called Flannan Isle, imagining a search party arriving to find the keepers gone and the famous meal untouched on the table. The poem was widely read, and it is genuinely beautiful, and it is also, as we have discussed, the source of details that were never in the real record. Over the following decades, the story kept inspiring artists. A composer, Peter Maxwell Davies, wrote a chamber opera called The Lighthouse, based on the disappearance. The band Genesis wrote a song about it in their early days. The mystery was woven into an episode of Doctor Who, and in 2018, more than a century after the men vanished, a feature film was released, with well-known actors playing the keepers, dramatizing one imagined version of what might have happened on that rock. There is nothing wrong with art finding inspiration in a true mystery. Stories are how human beings make sense of the things they cannot explain, and the Flannan Isles gave the world a mystery almost perfectly shaped for storytelling. But there is a cost, and it is worth naming. The more the legend grew, the more the three real men shrank behind it. They became figures in a ghost story, props in a tale of eerie islands and stopped clocks and untouched meals, characters who could be made to weep in invented logbooks or murder each other in invented madness. The actual James Ducat, with his 20 years of service and his 4 children. The actual Thomas Marshall, 28 years old, with all his life ahead of him. The actual Donald McArthur, the old soldier covering for a sick friend, who may have died running coatless toward the sea to save the others. They were quieter and more ordinary and more real than any of the legends, and they were in danger of being lost inside their own myth. To be fair, the world has slowly tried to make this right. In recent years, the people connected to these men have worked to remember them as men, not as a mystery. The community on the Isle of Lewis came together to save the old shore station, the big house at Brescleet, where the families once lived. After it was threatened with sale, Local people campaigned and bought it for the community and turned part of it into a place that tells the keeper's story honestly. A memorial was created and unveiled, a bronze wave sweeping over a small sandstone lighthouse set on a boulder of the ancient local rock. It was unveiled with the members of the keeper's own families present, including a relative of Donald McArthur, more than a century after he went out into the cold without his coat. Living descendants and relatives of the men have shared photographs and family information, helping to fill in the human picture that the legends had crowded out. The three keepers are no longer only a riddle in the village they serve from. They are remembered as three of their own. And that, more than any theory, is the right ending for this part of the story. Not a solution, because there is no solution, but a remembering, a turning back toward the men themselves after 100 years of turning them into something stranger and smaller than they were. So let's bring this back, in the end, to where it should always have been, to the three men. Here is where the case stands today, stated plainly, without embellishment. On the afternoon of Saturday, the 15th of December, 1900, three lighthouse keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur, disappeared from the island of Eilean Mor in the Flannan Isles. Their bodies were never found. The most likely explanation, supported by the physical evidence and accepted by the official investigation, is that they were swept into the sea by an exceptionally large wave near the west landing while securing storm gear, and that one of them may have died trying to save the others. No one was ever charged with anything, because there was almost certainly no crime, only the sea. The case has never been solved in the sense of being witnessed or proven, and it almost certainly never will be. It remains officially and forever an accident with no living witness and no final answer. That is what happened, but it is not who they were, and on this channel, that distinction is the whole point, because behind the case, behind the stopped clock and the cold hearth and the 100 years of poems and films, there were three real people. There was James Ducat, 43 years old, a man from Arbroath who had given 2 decades of his life to keeping lights for the safety of strangers, who had helped bring this very station into being, who knew that dangerous rock better than almost anyone alive, and who had 4 children waiting for him in a brand new house on the Isle of Lewis. There was Thomas Marshall, only 28, the youngest of the 3, a man at the very start of his working life, trusted with serious work at one of the hardest stations in the service, whose future ended on a winter afternoon before it had a chance to unfold. And there was Donald McArthur, around 40, an old soldier, a married man with his own family in the village, who was only out on that rock at all because he had stepped in to cover for a colleague who was sick, and who, if the evidence whispers what it seems to whisper, may have run out into the freezing wind in his shirt sleeves without stopping for his coat, because 2 of his fellow keepers were in danger, and he was the kind of man who runs toward that, not away. These were not eerie figures in a ghost story. They were working men. They got up in the dark and did their jobs in some of the worst weather in Britain, 20 miles from anyone who loved them, so that ships full of strangers could find their way home. They cleaned their lamp and filled their oil and wrote their weather readings on a slate and tidied their kitchen faithfully, right up until the last morning of their lives. And then they walked out to do one more piece of hard, necessary, dangerous work and the sea they had served against for so long reached up and took them. And they deserved better than what happened to them. They deserved to come home, to climb back into the relief boat and sail back to Briskleet and walk through their own front doors and be ordinary again. They never got to. So tonight, as you sit with this story, maybe try to remember James and Thomas and Donald, not for the strangeness of how they vanished, but for the steadiness of how they lived. Remember that their whole job, the entire purpose of their lonely, demanding, faithful work was to keep a single light burning so that other people would be safe. There's something almost unbearably gentle about that when you think about it. 3 men on a rock at the edge of the world, whose one duty was to make sure that no one else was lost in the dark. And in the end, it was they who were lost, and the dark that came for them was the one thing their light could never hold back. Have you ever wondered how many ships came safely past those rocks in the years the 3 of them kept that light? Sailors who never knew their names, who saw only a steady beam in the night and adjusted their course and lived. We will never know that number either. But it was not nothing. The work was not nothing. Whatever happened on the 15th of December, these men spent the time they had making the sea a little less dangerous for everyone who came after them. That is a good thing to have done with a life, however short, however it ended. The families never got their answer. 2 widows raised 6 children between them, with no grave to visit and no certainty to lean on. Only the knowledge that the men they loved had gone out one afternoon to do their duty and never come back. That grief did not end with the closing of the report. It lived on, quietly, in that village, for generations. And maybe the most respectful thing any of us can do, more than a century later, is to refuse to let the men be only a mystery. To remember that the question mark at the center of this story has 3 names attached to it, and 3 faces, and 3 families, and 3 lives that mattered. The light on the Flannan Isles still turns tonight, automatic now, tended by no one, sweeping out over the same grey water where James Ducat and Thomas Marshall and Donald McArthur were lost. Somewhere beneath that water, or carried far away by it long ago, are 3 men who were never found. Their story is still unfinished. It will always be unfinished. But they were here. They lived, and they worked, and they kept the light. And for as long as anyone tells this story carefully and remembers them as men rather than as a riddle, they are not entirely gone. Rest easy wherever you are. And thank you for listening to their story tonight.